So welcome everyone. Very excited to have you here this morning, this afternoon, maybe even this evening for some of you joining us. This is our second webinar in the ODC Division's webinar series on the scholarly foundations of the field of organizational development and change. And well, just a little bit about the Organization Development and Change Division for those of you who are maybe new to division. And what we aim to do is connect, come together to explore the research and practices aimed at developing healthy and humane organizations and communities. And together with David, Denny, and Ignacio, we're also working together on this webinar series in which we want to explore the foundations of knowledge for research and ODC practices that relate to vibrant, healthy, and flourishing teams, organizations, and communities. And what we want to do with these webinars is we invite panelists who have different perspectives, and we ask them to, from their own perspective, related to theory and practice in ODC, to share their knowledge and insights, and also to have the opportunity to engage in discussion with, well, today that will be David will be acting as a host in the discussion, and also a broader discussion with the audience who's joining us today. And also what we like to do with these webinars is to also engage a community and to gather more resources, right, that we can share on the ODC Hive for our members, aspiring members to learn more about ODC and also how they can use it in their own research and practice. So that's the broader goal of this webinar series. What I did, and we had a registration form for the webinar, so also to give you a bit of background of the participants that signed up to join us today at the webinar. Unfortunately, I also had some people who unfortunately couldn't make it at the last minute, but we are also recording this webinar, so we'll make it available for those of you that, for those that couldn't make it to the webinar, they can view it at a later time. So these are our backgrounds of the participants, and as we already noticed in the chat, we also have quite a geographical diversity of the participants here today, which is I think really wonderful that we can connect with people from different parts of the world here during this webinar. And then very excited to introduce you to our panelists of today. So first of all, Bob Quinn. Bob, thank you so much for joining us and for agreeing to be a panelist during this webinar. We're very honored and excited to have you with us today. As a short introduction, Bob has been a longtime member of the ODC division. He served as chair of the ODC division during the early 1980s. And he was instrumental in leading the discussion to change the name from Organization Development Division to the Organization Development and Change Division. He has an outstanding scholarly record, having written numerous books for both scholarly and practitioner audiences. And among his accomplishments, he's the originator of the Competing Values Framework, is a co-founder of the Center for Positive Scholarship, and he has been a leading figure in the positive organizational scholarship community. His career has focused intensely on how to bridge the worlds of scholarship and practice to create meaningful change at all levels of organization. Okay. So very excited for this perspective today. And then we also have, we're very excited to have Jill Paine join us as well as one of our panelists during this webinar. And Jill studied under Warner Burke at Columbia University in New York. And you co-authored a book, Organizational Change, a Comprehensive Reader. You're very passionate about practice and scholarship, and I think you're also very good in making this connection. You currently serve as the representative at large on the ODC board. and you previously served as a member of the organizing committee for the ODC Division 50-year anniversary dialogue and celebration. So very excited and honored to have you here as well. And what I'd like to do next is first to open up the digital floor to our panelists to first tell us a bit more about their perspective before we start engaging in the discussion with David Bright, and then move on to a broader discussion with the audience. So Jill, if I can start with you, you will tell us more about how leaders influence follower engagement in change and over time.
I'm muted. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction, Melanie, and thank you, David, as well, for the invitation. I know that Ignacio was part of that as well. I'm deeply honored to be here and to share this role with Bob Quinn, who's been a wonderful stalwart and a key seminal figure in our field for a long time, but not long enough. Your influence is long and deep, and I'm very honored to share the floor with you today. If it's all right, Melanie, I did prepare a few slides, and I'd love to share those, but I'm having trouble doing that, if that's okay. May I have some...
Maybe I should stop.
Access. Well, no, I think I just need... Let's see if I can replace. Yeah, maybe so. Here we go. I'm going to pick up on the theme that we've been talking about, this idea of practice and scholarship, but particularly a notion of how to blend rigor and relevance, something that I'm deeply passionate about. I know that Bob is as well, and many of you are too, or we wouldn't be part of this beloved division of organizational development and change at the Academy. And so I thought I might talk a little bit about my approach to this and a few of the projects, the ways that I go about researching certain areas, but also very much informed by the practice of change, and see if this somewhat stimulates conversations that we can have later about some of the work that all of you are doing too. I'm hoping that we can build on the foundations of our field that I will allude to a bit, and I know that all of us know that our field of organizational change and development was really always at the bridge, this epicenter of both science and practice. And so rigor and relevance has been something that is part of our field forever. It's something that, of course, management has been calling for across the divisions, across academia management, but across the field in general. How do we have a bigger impact? But it's something that our division has been talking about forever, and it is really at the epicenter of organizational development and change. So does everyone see my slides more or less? Okay.
Yes.
So I might start a little bit about my background. Thank you, Melanie, for the introduction. I started really being interested in the field of organizational change, leadership, and motivation at Columbia University. And I was studying under Warner Burke, who's always bridged the gap between rigor and relevance in his work, as well as over on the other side of the street with Tori Higgins in the psychology department, but he has a shared appointment at the business school as well. So this is really where I come from, the land of how do leaders motivate followers during times of change, and how do we sustain that motivation over time? I have been on the other side of the ocean in Madrid, Spain, for the duration of my career as a postdoctoral, then as a professor here. Rising through the ranks and really practicing what this looks like internationally as well, teaching different kinds of audiences. But my approach has always been from a scholar practitioner perspective. So all of my research is through collaborative efforts with organizational leaders who are undergoing and leading change efforts. And so through that experience, really this is where my research questions come from. And it's always in the realm of this kind of field theory and action research approach, where we're trying to gather research, understand what's happening in the organization, feeding it back, and then trying to understand how can we make change more effective. All of you know that when we're working with organizations, from many of our experience, that ultimately it comes with a challenge that leaders recognize in the environment what is happening, how can our current state is no longer a viable option, what is a way that we can either approach a new opportunity for change for a positive gain or address a challenge that we're facing. But our idea is that let's make a plan for how to have a significant impact and an impact organization where we are in a better organizational state, better desired future state in once we're completed with the change. But what actually happens is it usually gets worse before it gets better. There might be a performance dip, a learning curve, even customers that are needing to understand what we're offering in a new way. So this is really what actually happens, but I'm sure that all of you experience this when you're working in organizations or with organizations. Oftentimes it actually doesn't get better. We don't reach our intended state. And of course, we all know that's oft quoted that it's more likely to change to fail than to succeed large scale change initiatives. So to try to understand that better is really what I'm deeply passionate about. I came from practice first as a consultant in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom and decided to pursue my PhD and master's in a way that I could try to understand better why is it so difficult for organizations to successfully implement change, and how can we make the experience of change be something that people can endure over time? Understanding that this was a very difficult endeavor. And so I turned to positive organizational scholarship, something that Bob Quinn has shared with the world and the field in general, but trying to understand more the undercurrent of both at the organizational level as well as at the individual level. How can we do this better? So as I said, my approach is one that I'm sure all of you share, which is this idea of how can we have more of an impact through rigor and relevant approaches to understanding the kind of challenges that organizations are facing, and how can we help them and understand what's happening better through a collaborative approach. So this is a call to action across all of management. And we see this even in my own work of something that we're trying to understand how to do this better. There are challenges that are at the intersection of academia and practice, but this is something that our field has focused on for quite some time. One of my works in 2020 was to try to make the case, and it's one that Bob has done early on in our field as well, but to iterate that organizational change is naturally where we blend rigor and relevance. This is where it's a natural way in which we've always tried to approach how to advance our understanding of the way organizations change, the experience of people in these organizations undergoing change, and how can we endure that over time. So taking this as our approach, I might explain a few of the projects that I enjoyed, but I'll first put a bit of a call to action that came from not me, of course, but from some of our founders. And I could do multiple slides of those that have come before us that are currently doing this. Some have passed away, but have given us so much in terms of how to do or have a rigorous and relevant approach to our work. The foundations of our field have come from the great work of also Bob here, his colleague Gretchen Spretzer. We have Sue Morman, my mentor Werner Burke. There's so many here. Ed Schein, Denise Rousseau. This is who is at the epicenter of our field. We can have many, as I said, many slides with multiple pictures of people who have already been approaching our work with a rigor relevant approach. But ultimately, we might give credit to one of the founders of our field, and that's Kurt Lewin, who started by really emphasizing there's nothing as practical as a good theory. So there's always this blend of how can we be practical in our approach to science? How can we help organizations who are actually using our science? How do we make it relevant? But one of my questions is, how do we build upon the field of our that we have been given, handed down, the great principles, the great knowledge, the great science that's come from this rigor relevant approach, but in our current context? How does our current context either change what we knew before, expand what we knew before? How do we build upon that in a world that is more uncertain than ever before, with a greater demand for change, where organizations are having to change at a higher scale and on a more frequent rate than ever before. What are the implications of our field now? We've always known, even from Heraclides, saying there's nothing as current and relevant as change, but now it's never been more important. So how does our current environment change, alter, expand the way that we approach our research questions in a rigor relevant way? So what I indicate is that it really just says there's an increased complexity. So how do we approach this with an increased complexity? So I'll provide some examples from my own work, but I'm guessing that all of you can insert your own work and research questions in a way that we can understand what ways is our world more complex, and in what ways can we just build on our solid foundations and principles. So one example is, I take the two lenses primarily in my work. One is motivation side. So how do people experience change and become more motivated to pursue change goals, but over time? Because we know that there is no discrete change now. It's change upon change upon change, multiple changes happening simultaneously and at multiple levels. But then what's the role of leadership? How does leadership influence follower responses to change? And what is the role in the intersection between followers and leaders? So taking on this idea of complexity, we can first say, all right, there have been calls for organizations to be more agile, more resilient, more adaptable. But our question can be, what is the effect on the individuals in these organizations? Are we capable as individuals of constant change? We've always needed a Sabbath. We've always needed weekends, rest, recovery. We can draw upon work recovery research, energy research. Of course, Bob Quinn has been part of that as well. How do we understand the effect on the individuals inside organizations? Well, are they also called to have engagement, long-term, over time, strong engagement? And indeed, that seems to be the case. But what we see is a newfound response of quiet quitting and even burnout. So we realize it's more complex. People perhaps can't undergo change without built-in recovery systems. But what does that look like over time? So one of my questions is, when we build upon the research that we have so far, we can build upon engagement research. We know that work engagement is a good thing. It leads to higher good outcomes, positive job attitudes, lower turnover, higher performance, etc. However, when we look at the idea of what does that mean when we add change and complexity, we don't really know if we can both engage in our work roles as well as those new tasks, those new roles that are brought on by a change initiative or multiple change initiatives. So one of the work, the initiatives that I've been doing in an applied field research of a longitudinal professional services firm is we really looked at the differences between work engagement and change engagement, and we established that actually change engagement is a different construct. And they do have a relationship, but it's not always one that's positive. So indeed, those who are highly engaged in their work are more likely to raise their hand and be part of change and be engaged, but they're only able to sustain that over time if the organization provides enough resources to meet the demands of the change, if their values are aligned with the organizations and they actually believe that change is a good thing, it's something that matters to them too, and they feel that this is something where they're able to sustain the level of work and be able to recover their energy over time. So that's just an example of one way to approach that question with complexity. Another one is we think about, okay, well, is it only followers that are struggling with this high demand of change? That's not necessarily the case in practice. So if we lean into understanding what does it look like in the real world, we find that senior leaders are actually having a difficult time engaging in constant change. I'm not sure if any of you are big followers of football and soccer in the world of the United States, but we have an international audience here. We're doing the Euro Cup here in actually Spain has a game tonight for the Euro Cup semifinals. So it's a big deal here. But we see that this football coach of Jurgen Klopp of Liverpool's football club, he decided to resign earlier this year, despite being at the pinnacle of his career, doing quite well with his football club. He just said, I'm exhausted. I don't have the energy to continue. Jacinda Ardern also resigned when she was even heavily praised for her responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. As the New Zealand Prime Minister, she resigned in January of last year, citing that she didn't have the energy to continue to pursue. So we see that there's a problem. Leaders aren't able to engage in this kind of change as well. So maybe we need to think about the complexity of the effective leadership of change, but also what does the impact when leaders are fatigued and having burnout? What does the effect on the organizational change initiative itself, as well as the people who are part of it, underlying the energy toward effectiveness, but what happens when your own leader is already burnt out by the change? So that's one of the projects that Sarah Soderstrom, Art Upperty, and I have been doing. And Art was a former DBA, which is an executive PhD at IE Business School. We have senior leaders, CEOs, who are leading changes as a qualitative project to try to understand their experience over the long-term initiatives of change. And we have found that indeed, they have ups and downs, ebbs and flows, gain loops, doom loops of their experiences of the very changes they're leading. And so it happens also at the senior leadership level. And the difference is leaders have agency. So what happens when followers don't have that agency? How will that impact their experience of change? So I'll give you two more examples of the way that we look at principles and foundations of our field, but in a complex way. The next one I'd say is leader visions. This is a big focus of my work, is how do leaders motivate followers during times of change with the way they present the future state of the organization once change has occurred. Our traditional work has always said it's an opportunistic vision, an idealized future state of what the world looks like once change is implemented. But we look at the different kinds of that this may not always be the case. Is it always ideal? Is it always opportunistic? Is it always pursuit of an opportunity? Even Bob's recent work, you can find his work with entrepreneurs looking at the fact that opportunities and threats coming from the initial work of strategic issue framing and issue selling work and sense-making, sense-giving work, we find that the catalyst for change can be opportunities indeed, an opportunity for gain, but can also be a threat in the environment and a way to ward off that threat and establish stability. So it's true and important to understand the context and the catalyst for change. We see that even in Facebook, for example, was at a positive state in 2021, at least financially with the revenue. They had a PR issue, but they were at a place where they were able to have an opportunistic gain idea. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, presented a vision of the future state that they believe for their new company reveal of being called Meta. What would our world look like if we lived and worked in the metaverse? So this was something that was very much akin to the kind of leader visions we've always looked at in our science and practice of change. But then we look at how the context changed. And just in 2023, his vision was the year of efficiency. How can we become more stable after we have a threat of our very viability in the market being something that we are no longer able to keep the kind of employees? We have huge layoffs. We're not going to be able to have a secure revenue base if we don't change. So looking at the kinds of ways context, we have Chris Byron, Troy Higgins, and I have a paper looking at the way that it can be a catalyst for change, opportunity, and threat. But we can also, and leaders do, present what happens if we don't change. That's a future state. It's not a desirable one, but the world of what happens and what does our world look like if we don't change, as well as if we do change. So we can have a more complex view of the way leaders do and can articulate the future once we have or do not change, and what that looks like and how does that work as motivational mechanisms. But it's a more complex view of the types of visions. But we can also see that the visioning process, how leaders communicate change, is also more complex than the current original view of change is really that it starts at the leadership level. It's then translated down to the next level, down to the level after that, and so on. But that's not really how all change works. And my colleague, Sarah Soderstrom, who's also at the University of Michigan, has recently published in Annals work on really bottom-up change. And we're interested in understanding how different kinds of visions work, but coming from lower down in the organization, when it maybe is a catalyst understood by what's happening with our environment or customers, or something that we need to first understand within a peer group that's perhaps not as high status, it might be more informal, and how do we influence change going from the bottom up? The last one I'll share with you is a more complex view of responses to change. In general, our prior work has always looked at two-sided types of change responses. On valence, are we for the change, positive valence? Are we against the change, negative valence? But we found in a paper that I did with Xiao Orig, Nova Sverdik, and Myung-Gu Seo, we published this in JAP last year, understanding that it's more complex than that, that actually we need to look at the circumplex, which includes arousal. How much energy are we showing for change? And what we found is that when we look at the overall long-term effect of responses, well, yes, in general, we like engaged employees. We want proactive employees who offer creative feedback, who are interested in how to do change better, give us those kind of high energy, positive responses to change. But the second most helpful response over time was actually resistance. So we found that more than valence, positive or negative responses to change, what's actually most useful is more complex. Arousal is a more important one. If leaders tap into just engagement, overall level of arousal, having people care, wanting to have energy, they can actually even turn resistance into proactivity by listening, being active, incorporating feedback. This is something that can be very powerful in a time of constant change, allowing people to have the psychological safety to share real feedback, be very true about what's right about the organization. When it's always uncertain, we need all people looking out for what's working and what's not. That's that growth mindset, learning-oriented, innovative approach. So these are ways that my co-authors and I have looked at the complexity of change in the current environment, building on our foundations and principles in a rigorous and relevant manner. And my question to all of us as we think on this call is, how do we balance rigor and relevance in our own work? And how can we influence the science of practice and change overall? What are the ways in which the questions might become more complex? And how can we involve our practice partners if we're on the scholarship side, or our academic partners if we're on the practice side, to really answer some of these questions together? So I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jill, for sharing all this exciting, also recent research of your own work that you're focusing on. I'm particularly very interested in learning more about the work engagement versus change engagement paper, but I guess I can visit you during the academy, right, when you present this there. So wonderful, thank you so much. And I think also the questions you closed with are great input for our panel discussion with the audience later on. So thank you for that. But before we move to a broader discussion, I'd like to first invite Bob to share his perspective. So Bob, if you could, great, wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, I really appreciate it. Jill, that was magnificent, thank you. I thought I'd like to share just a few stories with you. And the first one that comes to mind is one night I was having dinner with Warren Bennis, and we were having a pretty meaningful conversation when I said to him, when you were a young man, what drove you more than anything else? He gave me an initial answer, and then he withdrew the answer, and he thought more deeply, and he said, I hungered to have a voice. I wanted to be able to say something and have people listen. And it's driven me all my life. And I thought, what an intriguing answer. I think that holds for you and for me. I think it holds for the people we work with in organizations. I think many of them are starved for voice and they can't find it. With that in mind, I'd like to take you through an early experience, a mid-level experience, and a current experience that we can then chat about. Early on, I came to the notion of change because of a personal change. As a teenager, I felt like a very broken person coming from poverty, trying to survive, trying to be heard, and having nothing to say. And then going through a personal experience that was incredibly transformative and healing. It was so moving that I made that my purpose in life. Now I was 18 years old. That led to a preoccupation all through undergraduate experience with the notion of change. When I finished my undergraduate program, it was organization development was just being born. It was an easy decision to go in that direction. And I loved it. On the research side, I was absolutely captured by the question of organizational effectiveness. If we're going to change an organization, what are we changing it towards? What is an effective organization? There was a growing literature on that topic. We did a series of studies that were different than the existing studies. Instead of looking at surveys, what people said about effectiveness, we decided to look at how researchers who were experts in organization theory, how did they think about effectiveness in organizations? And that led to the competing values framework. The competing values framework got picked up all over the world in terms of organizations applying it. 99.9% of the time when they apply it in an organization, it goes like this. Oh, you guys are a green group or the upper right quadrant, and you guys are a red group, lower left quadrant. No wonder. That's it. They see differences, and the model helps them talk about the differences. What they don't see is the integrations. They cannot see a dynamic reality in which those values are flowing into each other all the time, sometimes producing conflicts and sometimes producing synergy. If you understand those tensions, you can take any situation and begin to move conflict towards synergy. That's a very complex notion. Most people can't access it. That very much connected to the birth of positive organization scholarship. Jane Dutton, Kim Cameron, and I were all on the same wavelength, coming from slightly different angles. But the question was, what does an individual, group, or organization look like at their very best? We started that field, studies started to flow in. Kim Cameron and I went around the globe teaching from that research. Here's the answer to that question as we understand it today. Now, what would happen is we would be with a group of executives, often for a week. They would sit there Monday through Thursday on the edge of their seats. They loved the research. On Friday, I would say, okay, what are you going to go home and do differently? Inevitably, I would get this response: absolute terror. And it was fascinating. Why would these highly educated, highly paid people be terrified by the question, okay, you've now been exposed to all these notions of positive deviance. What are you going to go home and do? Well, I started to dig into that, and it started to become clear. They live in hierarchies, just like you and I. In hierarchies, we live in terror that we might deviate in some way. And if we do, we know what's going to happen. We're going to be sanctioned in some way. For people in corporate positions, it's so simple as they'll laugh, they'll roll their eyes. And we think, well, that sounds silly. But think about this. I'm a team leader in a company somewhere. I have two people I call my eye rollers. I introduce an idea. What's the first thing that happens in the meeting? They roll their eyes. When people tell me about that, I say, why did you tell me about the eye rollers? They don't know why. Well, here's the answer. Because you're paying a price every time they roll their eyes. In fact, you're supposed to be the team leader. You sit at your desk, you have many ideas that would improve the system, but you anticipate those eye rollers. You anticipate the resistance that Jill talked about. The result is most of those ideas go in the wastebasket. Now, the question is, who's running the company? Who's running the team? Is it you? Or is it the eye rollers? The people of deviance, the people who practice negative peer pressure, are incredibly powerful. And many people who claim to be leaders aren't leading because of the dynamics they live in. Executives are terrified of the question, what are you going to go home and do on Monday? How are you going to apply positive organization scholarship? And that's really stunning because it ties back to Seligman and his learned helplessness. We never presented on positive leadership where someone didn't come up and say, oh, I love this, but I work in a finance organization or a medical organization or a law firm. It didn't matter. You could fill in the blank, any kind of organization, or my boss is a monster. That is, everybody disqualifies themselves from the notion of pursuing excellence in a hierarchy. They live in learned helplessness. The thing that I'm trying to work on as a final project and put together everything I've done orbits around those notions of voice, of helplessness, of excellence. And I'm particularly interested in the notion of the expansion of consciousness, of creating excellence, of learning to create excellence, and to those things that push against it. If I go back to the competing values model, the bottom two quadrants in that model, the hierarchy and the market, contain all the values, all the assumptions that dominate conventional hierarchical thought. And they lead to logical problem solving, and they're based on the assumptions the economists tell us to be true. People are self-interested, rational actors. Self-interested, rational actors in systems of scarce resources and competition. If that's the fundamental starting point, if that's where most people are, then most people, most of the time, including you and I, are living in our egos. And we are living in fear. So one of the challenges is a question of how do we move people not from the bottom two quadrants, but to the entire picture. That is, how do you also engage the clan and the adhocracy quadrants, the people and the innovation stuff, and hold it all at once? How do you create excellence? What that suggests is there's a very complex way of seeing the world. And I'll close with this notion. Carl Weick and I spent a year reviewing hundreds of empirical papers on change. At the conclusion of that paper that we wrote, we said there are two ways for thinking about change that we see in these scientific papers. 99% of the researchers on change make the following assumption. There's equilibrium, and then there's disruption. The system changes and then goes into an equilibrium. 1% of the papers took an alternative view. It was a process view. It was a view that change is the constant and equilibrium is a temporary pattern. When you make that shift, it has huge implications for how you approach changing people, groups, and organizations. It's a very different view than the view that we take when we start in that conventional mindset. So in closing, I'm very interested at this point about how do we help other people incorporate very complex thought processes, take a dynamic view. Just a quick, someone told me that Carol Dweck recently made a comment. I don't know if she made it or not, but I love it if she did. She said, when most school teachers speak of the growth mindset, they speak of it from the fixed mindset. Now, that's exactly the same thing I'm saying about the competing values model. When people look at the competing values model, they're looking at it from the fixed mindset, from the bottom two quadrants. And the question is, how do you expand consciousness? How do you expand thinking so that people can answer Jill's question? That is, face all of the turmoil of the present day. How can I help other people feel safe, feel intention, feel love, and feel generative? And so that's where I am at this point, and hoping to find the voice that allow me to express that. So let me stop there and we can open up the discussion.
Wonderful, Bob. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and insights with us. And I think David, you've offered to start the conversation, and you actually have a couple of questions. I can put them on the shared screen for you. What would you like, or have you come up with other questions during the?
Yeah, I think we've got just 25 minutes left. So I think what I'd like to do is just have a conversation, and maybe we can spend about 15 minutes or so just talking about some thoughts, and then open it up to questions from the rest of our gathering. So if you have anybody who's participating in our meeting today, if you have some questions you'd like to offer, please put those in the chat, and then we will see if we can surface at least a couple of those in the last 10 minutes of our discussion today. So one of our drivers for initiating this webinar series is to really explore some of the foundational theories and practices of organization development and change as a field. And one of the things that we've recognized that there is a difference between theory and use versus a theory and practice. Theory or espoused theory, sorry. So the arduous theory and use versus espoused theory, right? And it's one idea that's occurred to us for how to identify foundations of the field is not to start with theory, but to start with practice and to start with the dependent variables. And so one of the questions I'd like to ask both of you to comment on, based on the perspectives that you have shared, what would be key dependent variables for the field as practice? In other words, if we're successful at creating change in organizations, what is it within organizations that actually shifts? So.
I could take a shot at that. I think that the ultimate dependent variable is learning. individual learning and collective learning. Another way to say that is the expansion of consciousness. Most of the time, people are engaged in incremental learning. It's safe, it's tied to the past, etc. I think the key question would then become, when does learning accelerate? When does an organization suddenly perform at a higher level? It always involves the transformation of consciousness, collective consciousness. The same thing holds for an individual. And so I think that there's going to be many answers to your question, David, but I think the first one that occurs to me is, can we explain the expansion and contraction of consciousness?
Great. And if I could ask a follow-on to that, why do you prioritize learning as one of the key dependent variables?
As best I can tell, as I try to make sense of life itself, is that appears to be the reason you and I are on this planet, to expand consciousness and capacity, and to make the collective endeavor more vital or successful or effective. When I transcend my ego, I'm always committed to the collective good. When my ego is governing my life, I'm committed to my good. My ability to bring about the collective good, the very end of organization development, is predicated on my ability to perform at a higher level, an optimal level. And that involves something that's very difficult for science to talk about, and that is morality, conscience, spirituality. I perform at the highest levels when I'm aligned with my conscience, when I'm committed sincerely to the collective good. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. Jill, what are your thoughts?
I love this question, and I loved Bob's answer. And I might expand on Bob's answer by one, just putting a big underline, underscoring it's important. I like the word learning. I actually liked your question too, of why learning. Learning is underscoring the real need to listen, understand what's happening in your external environment, in the context. It's taking information at the individual level. Sometimes it's listening, it's reflecting, but it's absorbing that information, determining what works, what is not working, and how can I adapt. And so if we look at learning at the core, I think we can come up with other terms, constructs that are very much what many scholars and practitioners, the managers alike, are focusing on, and that is innovation. How do we stay on top of what's happening in our industry and in our world before we are already outmoded, outdated, we're no longer viable? That's learning. So adaptation, innovation, grit. Grit is perseverance. Grit is being able to stick to something and despite challenges. So how do we focus on the longer term overall purpose, what our values are in a constantly turbulent, changing environment? So how do we set short-term objectives, but also stay true to the course, even when we need to be refining it? I think there's a part of that is energy, the organizational level, but also at the individual level. How do we sustain our energy when we are constantly under significantly increasing demands? How can organizations, if we know this is a challenge, how do organizations plan for change and design change so that we're not burning out our very best engaged employees, that we don't have people feel they have to start over to just hit refresh? But can't we different people in the organization use exploration at the same time, but by different people at different moments? I think if we're smarter about the experience of people's change, how they experience change and deal with energy maintenance, then we can plan for things so that we can be more resilient is another way of looking at learning. We can be more adaptive and more agile over time at the individual and the organizational level. But it takes us taking this knowledge of science and practice and putting it into practice when we do plan for change. How do we be better organizers and better leaders of change, knowing the challenges, the difficulties, so we can be learning and adaptive over time? So all of those different constructs, those are different DVs, but I think they're all very much related to Bob's answer of learning.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So the follow-on question I want to ask, Bob, you've identified learning as kind of a meta construct that could define an ultimate dependent variable for our field. And Jill, I think you've offered a number of ways that we could think about that and different dimensions that may be independent on their own, but also related. You've talked about grit, which I think is connected to character. So one of the ways to think about a dependent variable for the field is that we're helping people to develop and express character at a higher level, that the system is able to innovate at a higher level, that there's energy, preservation of energy, positive energy. So energy being another one. And then you highlighted resilience and an adaptive capacity. So the follow-on question is, in your mind, what are the key necessary conditions in an organization for any of these outcomes to be present? And Jill, I'd like to invite you to start with that and see where this goes.
Well, I think this is where anyone can contribute to this. So I am honored to be able to share thoughts. When I think about this, and I'll tell you that I do this in my research of thinking through what is a viable vision for the future state of an organization, but even when I think about what allows people to sustain energy, one of the resounding influences, the key variables that is important across, is if people's values are something that's taken into consideration. And it could be when we think about the organization, who are we? Rosabeth Moss-Cantor says, you have to know first your values. You have to understand your purpose first. It's something Bob was alluding to in his prior answer. But when we understand who we are, whether it's at the organizational level, the individual level, the team level, when we understand what we're about, regardless of the contextual changes around us, so that part stays consistent, and that's very much tied with our corporate purpose, and our values are very much intertwined. That is much more important, because the way we approach it in any one context might differ, but the glue, the compass, the rudder that is sort of the connection between all of those different pursuits is this real understanding of what is meaningful to me at the individual level, or to us at a collective level. Without that understanding, it's sort of arbitrary of the direction, and we can feel aimless. There's wonderful research by Mark Griffin and others that are looking at uncertainty, and they challenge this notion that uncertainty we always have thought about as something we're always seeking to reduce. But in certain contexts, and in learning and in innovation, we actually want to expand and lean into, create uncertainty so that we can think about doing things differently. That's that growth mindset, learning-oriented mindset. And it's in those areas that, how do we know what the difference is? What are the ways we want to protect the value we've created versus create the new value? And I think it's really about who we are. What is our value? What do we value? What is our core purpose? I teach a class to all of our executive MBAs and MBAs, and it's about your leader vision and the importance of that, but they create a vision following their executive or their regular MBA for the next chapter. And we start with values and purpose. It's so much more important. They're likely to have at least 10 careers in their lifetime. So what is the glue? Who I am matters much more than what I do. So it's that fear of failure, that I can't possibly make the next step, I might get it wrong, knowing that no, we're going to have a constantly changing context, but what we can get right is a deep reflection of what matters. who are we about? What kind of impact do we want to make, whether it's the individual or the organization's level? So values and purpose, I think, and what's meaningful to us is something where I would start.
Thank you, Jill. Bob, what's your answer to the question?
Jill's answer throws me into a dizzy spell because I have 1,000 things she stimulated. But just a couple of things. One, she uttered a phrase a few minutes ago, stay the course while changing it. I think that's a profoundly powerful phrase. And if you look at the imagery that it creates, stay the course while changing it. Stability and change simultaneously. There's an enormous challenge. How in the world do I do that? And indeed, that's the challenge that we face every minute of every day in every organization. In terms of the conditions that make it possible, how do I make David Bright feel safe right now, considering a new idea? How do I lift David Bright from a reactive state to an intentional state? How do I make him safe and move him to an intention, a desire to do something? How do I move David Bright from the natural ego state in which he segments himself from all the people to a state of interdependence, where he trusts others and helps others trust each other? And if I do that, how do I then move David and the people he's now integrated with into a generative state? How do I co-create a new future? I think that's totally compatible with Theory U. Stage one is basically safety. It's also unconscious hierarchical thinking. Stage two is economic pursuit of intention through competition, etc. Stage three is moving from, you've moved from dependence to independence. Now you're moving to interdependence. And stage four is co-creation. Those underlying conditions are all through all the developmental theories that we have. They're through so many other theories that we have. And I think that's the challenge that you and I have, is getting our spouse, our team, or our company to move from fear to confidence, from lack of focus to high focus, from segmentation and individuality to the collective focus, and finally to the question, and this is where Jill's key word about purpose and values becomes so critical. Purpose, if you get people to purpose, to higher purpose, it transforms everything. And, you know, I just published a book a couple of years ago on the economics of higher purpose with Anjit Thakur. That's a key lever. You move them, you get the safety, you move them to purpose, which most leaders and organizations do not know how to do. And then you move them to common purpose and to creation. And that's when you experience collective excellence. So those are the conditions that strike me.
Thank you so much. Those were incredibly rich answers. I think we have time now for a couple of questions from our other participants. So let's open it up for anybody who would like to raise a question. I don't see any in our chat at the moment. But would anybody like to raise their hand and offer up a question? Or a comment?
I was going to say maybe a comment as well. It's a discussion among like-minded individuals.
Hearing none. Yeah, go ahead, Ignacio. Go ahead.
Yes, I was very intrigued with all the also interested in all the conversations and the exposure of Gio and Bob. And the idea of learning and expanding consciousness has been a topic that I'm very interested in. So but in the context mainly of corporate sustainability and how leaders can, through an expansion of consciousness, can engage in actions and also like decision-making processes that are oriented to the common good. But it has been, even though I can talk about it in an academic audience, it has been difficult to have that conversation like freely with executives. So I wonder how you talk about this with change leaders or executives, because I think this is a really key issue in organizations, especially today with all the socio-ecological crisis that we are confronting now.
I think that's a great question. Over the years, I've evolved towards talking with them about these things by not talking. That is, I try to focus on what the key issue is. I then try to invent an experience that forces them to deal with what they don't want to deal with and then talk about it. One simple example is intimacy. I invented an exercise where they have to speak, they have to tell 3 core stories about their lives. In doing that, they expose who they really are. When I introduce the exercise, they're truly terrified. I have to model the process by telling 3 very intimate stories. Then I send them out, they do the exercise. It always transforms them. They come back entirely different people 1 hour later. We then reflect on what happened. They do a very poor, they're excited, but they do a relatively poor job reflecting. And so I give them some questions and the reflections get deeper. In the process, they find courage. That's not a measurable dependent variable in the normal sense of it. That's a virtue. They become more virtuous. They're able to expand their collective consciousness because they have respect and trust they didn't have an hour ago. Now that applies to all the other concepts. How do you invent some kind of exercise that takes them into what I call sacred space? A place where they have experiences they can't have in the hierarchical model. These people live in the conventional mindset. They live in the conservation bias. They are not prone to learning in the sense Argers talk about. You have to somehow help them overcome their own natural inclinations. Talking at them, giving them lectures, having them read papers is a very poor excuse for doing that kind of work. So that would be my first response.
Joe, what do you think?
I also love the question, and I think Bob's approach is extremely interesting and helpful. I actually, as you were talking, Bob, I was also thinking about Ed Shine's approach to process consultation, where it's very much not expert driven, even though you have expertise. But what he would iterate is that it's our role to be an active listener, to ask the right questions. That's where the expertise comes in, to be able to open the space for listening and for them to share, then to categorize, to funnel, to articulate, to translate their responses in a way that then perhaps even responding with more questions. Here's what I'm hearing, but this is what I'm seeing. And if we put these in this framework, it's a way to go back to the original term of learning. It's allowing them to learn the process of saying, what your experience is valid, it's important, and we're not laying on a cookie cutter template idea of what one size fits all. I go back to the idea of, I think complexity is the norm. And so we have to realize the most complex form of leadership is change leadership. And so if we allow leaders to realize it's listening and taking in information of their context, and the context may be different followers' experience, their own experience, learning from what works as well as what's not working, and using that experience to inform their next move, to inform how to take the next step with this follower who's challenging right now. What do I need to do in terms of what behaviors are working well in this context, and which ones aren't? Maybe they worked well in the past or in a different organization, but I need to adapt here. If we teach people by modeling the listening, reflecting approach of and asking questions, we're being vulnerable by allowing them to see how that actually lets that learning process be something they can start to model in their own organizations. But Ed Shine, that's kind of going back to this notion of these are the early foundations of our field. But I think that's still what I think works, and it's the only way for us to really understand how can we be most helpful going forward.
Let me build on that, because I love the word Jill used, the word expert. And I believe that the entire conventional mindset orbits around the word expert. There's enormous pressure in every situation for you and I to play the role of expert. I design an exercise for executives in which the only way they can succeed is to leave the expert role and listen. They always fail. They simply can't do it. Now, if you do get people outside the expert role and into the learning process, Bill Torbett's picture just flashed up on the screen. And whenever I think of Bill, I think of a sentence he wrote that I could never forget. And his sentence was, the way to build integrity is to constantly monitor your lack of integrity. When you pull people out of the executive, the expert role, and put them into inquiry, which is a transformation, you open the door for people to examine their lack of integrity, to examine their hypocrisy. Everybody on this call is a hypocrite, starting with me. I have values that are up here and behaviors that are down here. Looking at that hypocrisy is too painful to even imagine. What we're doing as OD change agents is we're helping organizations look at their own hypocrisy. That's a moral endeavor. We have a really hard time talking about things in the moral realm. OD is all about the moral realm. We just don't talk about that enough. And so that notion of the expert role, Jill, I think is absolutely central to becoming a great change agent.
Well, I'm mindful of our time, and I see that Bill would like to offer up a comment or a question. But I do want to honor the fact that we've made a commitment to end at 15 to the hour. Melanie, I think you have some closing things we need to do, and then we'll officially end our time together. And if you would like to hang out and talk after that, we can do so, as long as there's energy to continue a conversation. But we want to give people a milestone moment to be able to exit if necessary. So Melanie, I think you have some closing things you need us to do.
Great. Well, I think that's a wonderful approach that you suggest here. And it's getting dark. I see in my screen, but this thunder coming in. So sorry about this. It's just, let me see. Yes, we had some concluding remarks that we wanted to share. First of all, that has to do with the, we have a call for volunteers to become involved in our resources team. And Danny is also here. He's part of the resources team. So if you would like to get involved in the ODC resources team, please send an email to Danny. Maybe Danny, you can put your email address in the chat. And what does the ODC resources team do? It's concerned with filling the resources area on our division's website in both a meaningful and original way. And the area, so the resources area, it aims to provide a recent and comprehensive overview of journals, seminal articles, annual reviews of the field, and other material. And I think Jill has also given us quite some resources on her slides today, Danny, which we can include on our website as well. And also have potential tasks that could be compiling a list of ODC-related articles or contributing to a state of the field review. And tasks would be invited by mutual agreement and also according to volunteers' available time. I'm so sorry about, I'm going to turn on the light after I finish this. I'm so sorry. And what we also want to ask you to do is to fill in our evaluation form. As I said, it's a webinar series, so this is the second in our series. And well, we're planning to host quite a number more of these webinars. So if you have any feedback or input for us, it would be much appreciated. Also the kind of topics and perspectives you would like to hear from in future webinars. If you have any ideas or maybe suggestions for panelists, please let us know in the evaluation form. And Dana, I think will post the evaluation form link in the chat for you. And then another question from Danny, who's involved in our resources team, is if you might be willing to post in the chat the most inspiring articles, books, or chapters that you found most helpful to either develop your understanding of ODC and or to conduct research that relates to ODC. And if you could list up to 3, that would be a great help for Danny moving forward. And David, if you could take over, I'm going to switch on the light because I'm completely disappearing. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Melanie. It's evening there in the Netherlands too. So anyway, we're grateful for all of you for joining us today. And so this concludes our official webinar. We'll so if you would like to exit, you're welcome to do so. So we'll now transition into the after meeting discussion for anybody who wants to continue to this conversation. And as I said before, I'm happy to hang out as long as anybody has energy to continue. So we'll transition. And of course, Jill and Bob, if you need to exit, that's fine as well. So, all right. So Dana, well, I guess we can keep the recording going. So I see a number of you hanging out. Bill, I think you would like to offer up a comment or a question.
Yes. First of all, I'm just delighted to have been here and to listen to Jill and Bob. Bob and I go back so many decades, it's really unbelievable. And I just wanted to add to sort of take one step further, perhaps, what he and Jill are saying about how we actually make contact and transform situations. And one of the ways that I've worked with that is to create these intimate questionnaires, very brief for interviews. I do an interview the top team and get them to reveal their most honest feedback. In the interview, they're willing to do that about the other members in the team. And just to take one example of this, getting a president and his 7 vice presidents, 6 of the vice presidents agreed on who was the least functional member of the team. because he created too much conflict, and he got the ear of the president too often. And I gave them all the feedback before the meeting to discuss it, and suggested to this man that he would be the man who'd received all the negative feedback, that his best chance to move forward in the organization would be to be the first one to discuss the feedback and to own the feedback he'd received. And indeed he did, which was very moving and set the stage for everybody else to share what feedback they got. But it also led to the CEO saying, you know, I actually wish the rest of you were more like him rather than him more like you. And you can imagine that shook everybody up. So everybody got profound double loop feedback in the process. And it really then changed the relations within the team forever. So it's just getting as close as possible to that world of their practice. And this seemed to be one way to do it.
Fantastic example of creating an environment of safety that leads to the learning and the other outcomes that we talked about earlier. Thank you. Other comments, questions? And actually, let me ask everybody who's still here, would you mind in the chat, I'd invite you just to write down one insight that you've gained from our discussion. And so we can maybe compile a list of anything you're just thinking about. Lisa, I think you had a question that you were raising. Would you like to share that, or would you like me just to read that?
Well, I think I said that to everyone, and so maybe they saw it, but I've been thinking a lot about how this kind of conversation would fit into fits into the Academy of Management. I've been kind of trying to look at the sessions that are coming up for the annual meeting and plan my engagement there, and I'm just struck by how few places in the Academy of Management where conversations like this take place, and that even this idea of there's a management mindset that is very different from a development mindset. And I think it's a little bit like when Bob was talking about how when teachers speak of the growth mindset, they speak of it from a fixed mindset standpoint. I think that happens the same way with the managerial and a development mindset. When people often speak up, when managers or even people outside of the ODC division talk about a development mindset, they still talk about it from the perspective of a management mindset. And if you were to ask the question about dependent variable outside of the ODC, you're very, I think that it would be very rare that you would get the answer learning as a dependent variable, because it would most often be quantified and it would be performance-based, rather than a very sustainable quality of who we are and what's important to the sustainability of organizations and the effectiveness of organizations. All of those things we talked about: resilience, adaptiveness, grit. And I think about what the Academy of Management publishes, and I don't know where this fits into what the Academy of Management publishes or how they think about this kind of conversation.
So I think the question, if there's a question in there, it's like, how can we expand this conversation? And where are the safe places for us to do that? Or how do we create our own safe places in order to expand the spaces where it's possible to have a developmental perspective on how to effectively navigate within organizations? How well does that summarize what I think your question may be?
Right.
Okay, yeah. All right, so what are your thoughts, Jill, Bob, anybody else?
Well, if you take Bill's story, which I love, he gets one person to own it, to tell the truth, and it changes the culture of the management team. So it's now possible for the CEO who just learned something to say, I'd like you to all be like him. So we've gone to a whole new level of collective consciousness because Bill's taking them into sacred space. And then Lisa's saying, gee, I go to the Academy of Management and I go to those sessions and I don't see a lot of sacred space. That's absolutely true. Yet I suspect all of us have already started solving that problem. That is, I think we form networks. I think in ODC, it's particularly viable with people we trust. And we create conversations with people we trust. And I think as an academic, there are a few things more important than creating those sub-networks where you can come out of the expert role, which the academic system puts you into automatically, and you can learn together with your informal networks of associates. And I think if you talk to the older people, most of them look back on those networks as the source of inspiration, key ideas, resilience, etc. And so I think we recognize how the world functions as a managerial mindset, a conventional mindset. It permeates the academy. But within the academy, we can create systems that work in the very way we're talking about. And they can be incredibly powerful because these academics have thought deeply about these topics. And if you can get them into a safe space, the learning can be very high.
I might just give a bit of a push for our division. I mean, there are several of us that are on the board now of the Organization Development and Change Division. And we're right in the process of creating a new strategic vision for our division. And a big piece of that is, where do we see our role within the academy in the future? And I think, well, at least the board shares, and my guess is from even the survey results that we have received, that we all feel that this is really our home because we have this kind of dialogue, because this both and approach to having a rigor relevant approach to our questions, but also having a both and approach to trying to understand who are the right people to have at the table, managers, scholars, practitioners. But this isn't something that only we are thinking about. At least the senior leaders of the academy have been calling for more of a blend between scholarship and practice. How can we bring the manager back in, was our theme, I believe, last year. The Don Hambrick from Denise Rousseau, we've had multiple presidents calling for this. But it's now is the time, I would say, for us as a division to expand our reach. I love Bob's notion of networks. We have a pretty tight network and we're a pretty small division in comparison to others, but it might be our chance to really claim this rigor relevant impact kind of space and invite others in that may have another home. Their network might be more solidly in one domain of strategy or organizational behavior or entrepreneurship, but they're approaching it through a rigor relevant mindset, or they are trying to do a collaborative approach with scholars and practitioners. They're wanting to have an impact where managers are actually using the research that comes out of these efforts. But we can be a place where they find a second home, another home. And I believe that we can expand that network and really make big efforts to have dotted line relationships so that people find that we might be the how. Because while learning might be a process or mediator or moderator, but not always RDD, in this way, we're saying in order to address complexity and a need for agility, learning is the only way that we can continue to be viable, continue to be sustainable as an individual with well-being, but a viable competitive organization. And that is something that we can show through empirical results, but also it is the way that the turbulence is calling on us to take a real stand and help invite scholars who have that approach. I think we can have a much bigger voice in Academy going forward. So these conversations happen everywhere, not just in our division, and it won't be a small division going forward. That's my hope.
Yeah. Thank you, Jill. I appreciate that so much. Okay, I think we've hit all the questions that popped up in the chat. Oh, let's see, we've got Eldon. Is Eldon still with us?
I might say one quick thing, David. Ignacio has alluded to this in the chat. There is a wonderful PDW that we are offering right before the big Rigor Relevant Award that is sponsored by the ODC division and INSEAD, where we are honoring both Jane Dutton, but also Kathy Eisenhart. Last year, it was Don Hambrick and what's wrong with me all of a sudden? I'm having a forgetful moment. It was Henry Mintzberg. What
Henry
in the world?
Mintzberg.
So
Yes,
yeah. But it was standing room only. And this year we're offering a PDW ahead of time on rigor relevance, sponsored by our division, that is all about the grand challenges and how rigor relevant approach is perhaps the way to do it. The whole idea is to invite people who are from all across the academy dealing with these grand challenges, from AI and the future of work to healthcare to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, etc., but through a rigor relevant approach, and then everyone can funnel into the award presentation. We will be doing this every year. It will be annual. So please do attend, make a big splash so that we can continue to have this role within the Academy.
Tobias, we'll find a link and we'll follow up with that in in our follow-up communications. And I would also add, in addition to that event, we are hosting a PDW that is a continuation of this webinar series. This is the first year we're doing it, but we may make this a kind of a standing PDW where we can have a continuing discussion and dialogue on some of the questions that we've raised here. So we've had, this is our second webinar in this series, Foundations of Organization Development and Change. This is something we plan to continue and potentially even turn into a formal research project where we can maybe push in a rigorous way some of the questions that we've discussed today. I think we've exhausted the questions, unless I've missed something. Would anybody else like to offer a question or a comment, or shall we?
I'm just thrilled and grateful for what you folks are doing. I think it's absolutely on the right path.
Thank you, Bob. Very grateful for that. Okay, so to close out, I'd really like everyone to write down one. It could be 3 words or less, one insight or one feeling you have, one thought you have as we finish today. I'm gonna mutuality, love that. Energy, delight, learning, curiosity, purpose, fun, love that. Very good. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. We encourage you to spread the word that we're doing this, and encourage our colleagues and friends to join these events in the future. So I look forward to seeing hopefully many of you at the Academy of Management in just 4 weeks. And thank you again for being here.
Yes, and thank you so much, Bob and Jill. It was a great honor to host you today.
And thank you, Melanie and David, for hosting. This is wonderful. Thank you all for your attention and engagement and great comments.
Wonderful.
All right.
Great. Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.